I'm so excited for your bustles. I think they're going to look amazing. And I love that you're all doing some fun fabric choices because like we were talking about before, this is like any sort of underpinnings. They're not going to be necessarily visible, but you get to wear them and you might as well have fun with it, especially if getting a white fabric is the same cost as getting a fun fabric. Or if you're working from your stash, why not use a fun cotton from your stash? So, since we saw each other last, I prepped my bustle fabric, which was more fussy because I decided to do a rainbow. And so I had to cut my pattern pieces apart and create like little wedges of color for the back of the bustle and then sew that together to get my shape. But I've got it, it's ready to go. And I'm very pleased with it, if I do say so myself. And it will make some parts of this like easy. But if you ever want to piece or do an array of fabrics or colors for your bustle, I'll take some pictures of how I broke apart the pattern. It wasn't hard to do, it was just fussy to do. So, and it looks better flat on the table, but you can see this is what my piece looks like. And we're gonna
Sure.
be marking these up
Cool.
so that we can figure out where our boning channels go. This is going to be really easy for me to stitch together because I have these very obvious lines that are sewn in to the back of my bustle that
Flip
are,
it around. I want to see the other side, just to see where you. Yeah. Okay, they pieced it together. Wow,
yeah,
fancy, very fancy.
thank you. Thank you. So, it was fun to do. I'm very happy with how it turned out, and it was worth the extra effort, but it was extra effort. I wouldn't suggest this for like a first time bustle because it is like kind of a fussy thing to do when you're still figuring out the pattern, but it wasn't like an impossibly hard thing to do or anything like that. So, when I'm marking my bustles, I like to use a variety of things. Sometimes I just go in with my Chaco and I like use this to mark things. I'll show you how I do that. I often use my little marking wheel and some handy dandy tracing paper because I find this to be one of the easiest ways to mark. As an aside, I do love this fancy double-wheeled rotary or marking wheel. It's not necessary to have the two wheels for this, but sometimes it's nice if you're like increasing your seam allowance or something like that. It can be really helpful. Um, and also sometimes I use a Frixion pen or a number two pencil. It depends on the fabric and what is going to show up best and all of that. This is very colorful. So the truth is, I'm not really sure at the moment what is going to appear the best on it, which gives us a lot of fun opportunities to look at different options for marking things. I recommend having a straight edge around for this so you get nice straight lines, especially if you feel wobbly at all with your tracing wheel. And but definitely if you're using like a Chaco or something like that, you'll want a nice straight line because that's going to be your guide for sewing in those boning channels. So as I mentioned on Sunday, I prep my pattern by tracing all of my boning channels with a Sharpie first. And this way I can see it through the paper on both sides. Of course, there are lots of ways to go about like making your markings visible, but this is just like my very cheap, easy, lazy way to do it. It's just to make them visible on both sides of the paper. Um, and I find that a black Sharpie gives enough appearance through the paper. that I can really see what's going on. So you can, it's faint, but it's enough. It's obviously very clear on the right side. And if I lie it down on my fabric, I'm like, oh, it's still hard to see. I can always go in and like give myself some marks on top of the Sharpie to like reinforce that. So let's take a gander, shall we? Mm. As an aside, if I set up the screen ever and you can't really see things that well, or you feel like you can't see enough of what's going on, please speak up and let me know because I can't always tell what it looks like for you.
What's the
So
number of that pattern in Truly Victorian? Because
it's, yeah, it's TV 163.
163. Okay. I was gonna
Mhm.
look at the picture on here because
Yeah.
I haven't done this and I have enough ass that I don't need a bustle. So
I don't know, June. I got a lot of ass and I still love to put a bustle on it. So, sometimes you just need more ass. Now, here's a fun thing I learned while prepping this time that I hadn't really paid that much attention to when I'm just doing it for myself, is that these little boning channels are actually 5/8 inch wide. Now, that's because they're expecting you to line up your channel in between the lines or right on the lines and then sew slightly in. So they end up being somewhat smaller than that 5/8, more like a 1/2 inch wide um, sewn channel. I normally just do a 1/2 inch wide piece of finished fabric. That means that it's wider than a 1/2 inch when I'm starting. And so the other thing is typically I just mark the top line. I don't mark both because once I've stitched it along the top, I just smooth it down and then I stitch the bottom edge. So I don't need to make sure it's lined up on the bottom because the fabric will do that for me. So that's sort of my approach is just marking these top lines. What I did when I was cutting and prepping all of this is I placed my seams so that they're basically in the middle of all of my boning channels. So you won't see the seam once the boning channels are in place because I'm going to put my channels on the outside of my garment to be decorative. She has you put your channels on the inside of your garment so they're not visible. And it really is so that people can't see the channel because it doesn't affect the efficacy of the bone, whether it's on the inside or the outside of the garment. And I also feel like you can still see the stitch lines. So if you're doing like a white fabric with white thread with white boning channels, it will be kind of invisible from the outside. But if you're doing fun colors and things, why not make the outside as decorative as you want it to be? So I just normally put those boning channels on the outside of my garment, but that's a choice that's aesthetic and up to you. I have some fresh tracing paper here. I love tracing paper. It's wonderful for transferring marks. For something like this, where I'm going to be tracing onto kind of dark fabric, I want a kind of light color for my tracing paper. And I happen to have a little piece of white, which hopefully will show up really nice. What I'm going to do
You
So
go
I'm
with
gonna start. Yes, go
waxed
ahead.
or unwaxed tracing paper?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. I think, man, it feels really waxy and it doesn't say on the package. Yeah, I I think this is waxed. So it feels waxy. I think
Thanks.
waxed is the kind I like normally, but
Yeah, I prefer the waxed because the other kind rubs off before I get around to using it.
yes, yes, exactly. And I
But
want this to
then,
be.
yeah, but
So
it could always,
sometimes, yeah, I mean, also you've got to find the thing that works for you and what's available. So I just folded this in half and sort of tore it straight down the middle, partly because I don't want to have a lot of excess running underneath the pattern as I'm working. Just going to slide it under right where I want to trace. It's important to find a way to anchor your pattern onto your fabric as you're working. So you can pin it. Pins are always very firm anchors. You can obviously use your pattern weights. It's really what works for you, but you want to keep this from moving around too much while you're tracing because that will help you get a more accurate trace. Now, I do happen to have my double wheel here. And if you've got a double wheeled tracing wheel, you can set it up to be exactly the width that they drafted in, or pretty close. And so you can get both lines if you want. But again, I'm not particularly worried about that second line. When I don't want to have a double, I can just pull out the second wheel and just do one at a time. These are really fun in that they're adjustable. I'm just going in pretty firm, and I tend to go back over mine because I'm a little bit paranoid always that I won't get a nice, strong, dark line and it'll be hard to see. Okay, I'm just going to fold part of this pattern out of the way so we can look at what's going on. All right, so there's my line. It's not super vibrant. I don't think it's super vibrant on the camera. It's visible to me, but it's pretty faint. Be in part because this is just dark fabric, but it would be enough for me to use as a guide when I'm sewing and I don't necessarily need anyone else to see what I've got. So that definitely works. But let's say you trace it on and you're like, my eyes get tired. My workshop is kind of dark. I need it to be more strongly visible. You can always come in with your straight edge and some sort of colored choco that's going to work against your dark fabric and just mark right over the top to reinforce that line. You could also do this with a number 2 pencil or with a Frixion pen, depending on what you have kicking around. Now it's more visible. It's easier to see, hopefully for you guys as well. So that's my first, or rather, that's the first one I'm marking, but it's my 7th channel. So it's the one at the bottom. And I started there because I'll work from bottom to the top. I think it'll be a little easier for you guys to see.
Yeah, I never have luck with the white waxed paper.
Yeah, it was very faint.
I always use yellow.
Yeah, the white came up first. So I just grabbed it. But like, you've got sometimes you have to try out a few different colors to see what works on your fabric. It doesn't take so long to do the marking that having some trial and error is, I think, too odious. But I like to cut down on how much sort of doubling up of labor I have to do, if you will. So let's look at how the yellow looks on our blue and see if it's a little stronger, because Martha's right. Sometimes that white is just not very strong. I'm going to do the same thing where it has a fold down the center. I'm just going to tear it in half. And I'm going to slide it underneath here and drop my pattern back into place. My goal is not to shift my pattern around very much as I'm working, so everything stays lined up where it's meant to be. And we're going to do that again, but this time with our boning channel 6. And again, I'm just going to go and really press firmly. Not so firmly that I'm giving myself like hand pain or anything like that, but firm. So I get through the paper pattern and the waxed tracing paper all the way to my fabric. You want to try and follow your lines pretty strongly. Come back over here, do the second half. Let's take a look here. Now, I think the yellow's a little bit more visible, but still really faint on the camera is kind of what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I
And
don't see anything.
right. So I'm actually just going to go in here again with my straight edge. And I'm also going to make sure that this is lined up where I meant for it to be lined up. If I'm using the straight edge, then it's really easy for me to make sure I'm getting a nice straight line. And the yellow Choco does show up really beautifully. And then you can really see what I'm doing. So that's very helpful to just have a visible line. And I only need that one line to be going on with. The challenge with the Choco is exactly the same challenge Martha was talking about with the unwaxed tracing paper, in that the Choco can rub off. So typically, if I'm going to use a Choco, I want to be sewing it pretty quickly. I don't want to leave it because those marks will rub off. Like, they rub off pretty easily. And if I leave it for a week, the marks are going to be gone by the time I come back to it. Let's say you don't have a Choco, you don't have tracing paper, you meant to get them, but you didn't, or they were out at your local store, or you thought you had some, or you've never used it, right? You can also go in with a couple of pins and make some pin marks and then connect the dots essentially. And so normally what I do is I just go in and I line it up with the marks on my pattern. And I put a couple of pins. And then I like can connect the dots, as it were, by coming in here with my ruler, lining that up, and then using a pencil or a Chaco or a Frixion pen to connect the dots. Now, a thing I did for myself, because I was breaking everything down and creating these little new pattern pieces, is I actually measured the position of my of where those boning channels were. And so what I can do for myself, or what you could do for yourself, is you could just know you've measured, you've gone in, you've been very persnickety, and you can actively use a tape measure and a seam gauge to position everything very manually. With something like this, where I have got these sort of embedded lines because of how I broke the pattern apart, it's faster for me to go in and just manually do that with my ruler than the other two options that I showed you. But for most people, I think that using either your tracing wheel or pin marking is going to be the easiest, quickest option. So that's the one, those are the two I most strongly recommend. But if you're like, I want to measure, I want to make sure that everything is just so perfect, then you can just go in with your ruler and a measuring tape and plot out where everything goes. So, all right. I'm going to finish putting in some of these boning channel marks, and then we're going to talk about connecting these two pieces to each other so that everything's lined up properly. But I'm not going to make you watch me draw a bunch of stuff in. After a while, it gets very tedious because I'm just repeating the same step over and over again. Watch me draw a line again. So, but I will say that I am really liking the way that I sort of set up a grid for myself magically with the way I cut the fabric, because that was an unintended consequence to have that be so such a hack. Normally, I would not have that as um, a hack for this. I would need to do the other two options. I'm not that into measuring everything very carefully with a ruler and a measuring tape to put in these kinds of boning channels. I'll do that for a corset, but for this, I just want it to be approximately in the right place. Part of that is that it needs to be symmetrical. So I want it to match up across the two sides. And I also want it to like create the shape that I'm looking for, but I don't necessarily need it to be supporting and shaping my whole body in the way that a corset does. I do love a clear ruler for this kind of stuff. Now, Martha, you have a very busy fabric with a lot of color. It's going to be hard potentially to see any marks on that pattern. So
That is correct.
you're going to have to try some different options. Now, is the pattern as vibrant on the back as it is on the front?
Not really.
So in
Uh,
your shoes, I might mark on the back.
oh, and just put my boning channels on the back.
Well, here's what I would do if you want them on the front. I have a suggestion. It adds an extra step. I would mark it on the back and then I would go in and I would run a basting stitch in a bright white thread so that I could see it from the top side.
Okay.
That is
Yeah,
how I would make.
I really want to have the boning channels on the outside because I went
Yeah,
to all the trouble of finding a brown fabric that coordinated. But yeah, I
yeah,
didn't really think about how I was going to mark on this puppy because it's
yeah.
very busy. It's very neon-y. I mean, it's not quite neon, but it looks like it glows. Okay,
It
let's just
glows.
say.
It's very, very bright. And there's a lot of color. So it's not like, well, it glows, but it's all, dark colors, or it glows, but it's
Yeah,
all bright colors. So I can use like a dark marking tool. In your case, it's all the colors. So that's
yeah,
why I would like mark with my tracing wheel or my Chaco or a pencil on the back and then baste because there's no reason not to do the decorative thing. You just need to take an extra step so you can see it. And I think a nice bright white thread would be the most visible.
yeah.
So
Because there's really no white on there.
yeah, that's what I was picking up from the screen.
Yep. Okay, I'll do that.
I
Um,
Great.
have a,
that
I have
will
a,
be easier.
You have it
hey,
easier?
No,
Did
no,
somebody
that
say,
will be easier than what I was
oh,
contemplating.
great, good, good. I'm like, oh, does somebody have a different suggestion? That's great.
I have a densely print eyeball fabric that glows in the dark that I considered using for this. And I went, no, it's no fun if no one can see it.
Right? Oh man, but that sounds like great fabric.
Yeah, I just don't know. I bought it and went, okay, I'm only buying 2.5 yards. I'm not going to buy the whole bolt.
I mean, Alicia, what I hear is a wild and crazy um corset in your future, honestly. Or a
Yeah, I was thinking that.
delightful uh Lovecraftian inspired bodice for an evening ensemble.
Oh, I don't know the thought.
That's what I'm hearing. Okay, so I've done one side and you can see that I've got my marks in. They're pretty faint for you guys, but you can see them well enough to see how I have laid that out on this side. I'm going to do the other side so then I can show you how I will mark that and like arrange it together.
And you're just marking the bottom of the channel, right?
Just one side. I'm marking the tops of my channels because that's just what works for my brain. But really, it's whatever works for you.
Okay.
June, it was wonderful to see you tonight. Enjoy your dinner. See you later, lady. So yeah, whatever you mark, whether it's the top edge or the bottom edge of that boning channel, what matters is you're consistent and you know what you did. And if you prefer to mark both sides, there's no crime against doing extra work if it helps you out. It's just that I am always going to be the lazy girl who tells you the simplest, quickest ways to do things as far as I know them. Because what I really want is the joy of making the thing and wearing it, and not necessarily the nonsense of prepping the thing. The nonsense is essential, but I try and find the ways to make the nonsense as like quick and painless as possible. I will say that I had probably a tiny bit of pattern creep when I broke apart the pattern and I pieced it together. I think I added maybe like an eighth of an inch too much to my seam allowance. Um, and so I shifted things just a bit, but it's consistent, so I'm not worried about how it'll come together. But keep in mind, that is a danger when deciding to do something wild and over the top, as I chose to do.
But that's why we like you.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I will mostly do the wild over the top things. And if we have time tonight before we wrap up, I will show you the sketch I'm going to be posting on Patreon with a little discussion of our big costume set that I'm doing this year. Because when Tracy Benton saw the sketch here in Tucson, her first reaction was, "Have you lost your mind?" That is a direct quote. "Have you lost your mind?" So it's very over the top, and I'm super excited. And the answer is yes, definitely. I have lost my mind. But that's okay. Sometimes you have to swing for the fences, as they say. All right. One last thing to trace in. I just want to make sure I got this where it needs to go. And again, as I mentioned last week, if you're within a 16th to an eighth of an inch of where you need to be on both sides, you can always zhuzh it into position with each other. But if you start to be more like a quarter of an inch different in where you've positioned things, you probably need to go in and check all of your markings and make sure that the side that you haven't gone too off kilter on one side, and pick the side that is going to be right for you. Okay. So last week, I think it was last week, I mentioned that pins can be the enemy. Straight pins, of course, are a wonderful, helpful tool. We need them in our workshop, but pins also can stab you. They put holes in your fabric. They take time to set up, and they can break your sewing machine needle if you're not careful. But if you need to match things just so, pins are still one of the best options before hand basting. Hand basting is actually the very best way to make sure everything is matched just exactly as you want it. And hi, Cake. I have absolutely hand basted things for pattern matching. I did that. Cake. Cake. Cake, your tail. I did that for the beautiful faux gussets on my Pride bodice in order to make sure everything was lined up just exactly right. I actually hand basted that center seam before I stitched it. But often, if you can sort of pin baste things by carefully pinning. So what we're going to do for this is the pinning method. And hi, buddy. Oh my gosh. I swear I gave him treats and everything before we got started, but he's like, no, I must have attention right now. So as usual, you want right sides together. And if your cutting has been pretty precise, everything should sort of line up well. If your tracing has been pretty precise, everything should be roughly in the same ballpark. If your cat is not helping you right now, it will be probably easier. So let me lay this out. One of the things I do when I am pattern matching something like this is I do go in and I visually make sure my little seams are matching on both sides. And sometimes I do need to like actually, oh my gosh, cake, really? My darling, having a cake break. Sometimes I find that it is helpful to actually hold it up off the table and take a look at that and make sure both sides are looking roughly the same before I go in. And I'm not putting this down right now because my cat is losing his mind. So what I do once I'm happy with that position, take my handy dandy little pin, and I don't go straight down. I'm actually going to go at an angle from one side. Cake, boy howdy, my darling. And then I'm going to take this pin. I'm actually going to make an X with my pins right at that join that I want to stay very secure. This is what they do in some of the bigger costuming and fashion houses in New York when they want to pin something that they're pattern matching to make sure that it will not come out of position once you've put it in position. If you cross your pins like this, it is a very firm lock. That is not going anywhere. It doesn't matter what I do. And the pins are not going to really go anywhere unless I pull them out. So this is a trick I use for this kind of fussy pattern matching. And so I'm going to come in, I'm going to move to my next one, make sure I'm happy with how that's positioned, and do the same. Sometimes I have to do this in the air like this because I need to be swapping back and forth between sides. And sometimes I do it flat on the table. It kind of depends on what I'm pattern matching and how. If we continue down the line of projects that we're doing right now, honestly, we are going to end up making a tailored bustle bodice together, probably in 2025. And at that point, I will talk a lot about pattern matching. I don't recommend pattern matching for corsets usually, except for in a few small portions of the corset, because there are a lot of curvy seams and it will make you kind of cocoa banana pants. I will pattern match sometimes in a skirt, but usually not to the degree that I'm worried about in a smaller, more focal piece like the bodice. So for something like this, pattern matching here is like a very extra kind of thing to do. And it's only necessary because I decided to put this kind of pattern into my bustle and arrange it so they should line up. If you've got a really busy print, I don't think you need to worry about pattern matching usually. The eye is not going to mostly pick up what's happening. If you've got a really small polka dot or floral or something like that, again, it's so busy and so small, people are not going to be noticing it. But if you have a beautiful symmetrical print or a plaid, you may want to do some pattern matching. And if you're doing like a plaid bustle cage, this is the year for it. It's the year of the plaid. But I would probably pick like one direction of the plaid that I was going to match along rather than trying to match exactly perfectly with every element of the plaid, because this back seam is very curved and that's going to make some types of pattern matching really hard. So I clearly sewed one of my seams a little bit off by about a 1/16 of an inch. That's okay. It is going to be hidden underneath that boning channel, so I can be a little bit more loose. But again, I'm doing my little X's. all the way down. Often when I'm doing a bustle cage like this, I do not do this kind of fussy pinning. I just go in with clips. So special situations require more fussy, ridiculous techniques. If you don't have clips, you know, I extol their virtues all the time. I really like them. But let's say you don't have clips, but you do want to do something quick where you can kind of check and see, is everything lining up? Go in at roughly your 1/2 inch seam allowance and just run the pin parallel to the seam edge. And then you can open your garment up and you can look and see how it's matching and just confirm, yes, what I'm doing is working out. It's like a quick pin basting technique. But yes, often if I have something supremely fussy, very finicky and kind of slick, I will 100% go in and hand baste along those seams if I'm pattern matching. Okay, so I've pinned this all together and I've got my panels lined up. I'm going to open it up and hopefully you can see the marks. It's, again, they're a little bit more faint than I wish on the screen. So let's look at this. Maybe. There we go. Okay, okay, sorry about the motion sickness. Okay. So I think the yellow one is like the easiest to see. And it is lining up pretty well. So I'm super happy with that. Most of them are lined up pretty well. The only one that's a bit off kilter is my bottom purple one, and that's off by like a little less than 1/8 of an inch. So not too bad. That's good enough to be going on with and to get into the sewing. What I'm going to do now, we're going to go in to the sewing machine and we're going to sew just a straight stitch all the way down this center back seam. And once we've sewn that, we'll be snipping because it's a curved seam and pressing it open. And then we will move from there to the next steps. Any questions before we progress? Because I feel like I've blown through the marking and everything. And I just want to make sure that you guys feel comfortable with those steps before we proceed to stitching.
I feel comfortable.
Oh, thank you, Martha. Good. Well, I
No,
sort
I
of
think it's, you know,
go ahead.
no, I got it. I think it's pretty straightforward.
Thank you, Alicia.
Yeah, pretty straightforward and
I
good pattern matching. I almost did the same thing because I have this stack of 1-yard cuts of quilting fabric with a leaf motif on it and it's a rainbow color, and I almost did it and I was like, nah, it'll be too copycat. I can't do that.
do it
Well,
later, you know, give yourself 6 months and then everybody will be like, oh, it's plants and the rainbow. So
It is,
exciting.
it's
Yeah.
leaf.
yeah, if
Or
I
This
choose the
raises the
Waverly
question.
fabric. Oh, go ahead.
Oh,
Go ahead.
sorry, I was changing the topic. Go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. If I choose the Waverly fabric, yeah, we will be pattern matching.
Yes, because that fabric is like a big enough print where I think that you will want the pattern matching. The real trick with this guy on pattern matching, honestly, is
Just color.
this portion if you're not doing something like I did, where you've got sort of like you've cut wedges of fabric, if you're just cutting it on a single piece of fabric, this curve, the first 10, 12 inches of the bustle is a pretty sharp curve, and it will be hard to pattern match exactly there. But you can think about how you want that pattern to line up there. The lower portion of the seam should be pretty straightforward, if you will excuse me, to pattern match, because it's not very curved at all. So, and Alicia, if I were using that Waverly print, I would pattern match it. I absolutely would, because it's
Yeah.
just, it's got that vibe. I'd probably try and like at the top, I'd probably try and get my cut in a white portion so that the like rondelles are on either side of the seam rather than across the seam. And that's how I would cheat the pattern matching towards the top at that really extreme curve. But like every pattern matching scenario and every fabric, you have to like approach with a unique solution for that fabric, because they're not all the same. All right,
Yeah,
so
but
now,
then it means I have to pattern match the corset, and that might just I might need a big bottle or something.
oh
Pattern
yeah,
matching that corset would suck.
I
And I'd
mean,
have enough left over.
yeah, I
Yeah.
I would have some approaches to that to save my sanity, but like a nice large bottle of wine might be one of those approaches, depending.
I
All
also
right,
would
so
do some color blocking on the corset so that you didn't have to match on every seam. I would
yeah,
Oh
color
yeah, that's
block.
fair.
So I
I'd
would
have to
get the
find
two
like
colors of the rondelles and I would color block it, and it would be really pretty
yeah,
amazing.
I would color block. I love color blocking on a corset, right? And I honestly, a thing I've done for pattern matching in corsets is that I'll do like the print in the front two panels in center front, and the print in the back two panels in center back. And I'll match there, and then I will do like a coordinating color blocked fabric on the side panels so that it looks very sharp, that I'm not trying to pattern match across the curviest possible seams in the universe and drive myself cocoa banana pants.
But that's what
Yeah,
you have to do with lace patterns sometimes too, over seams.
yeah, just
Motif out and lay it across the seam.
and like
But
sort of piece it. Yeah.
yeah, and Alicia, if you want to have more than one panel with the print on it, what I would do is line up the rondelles at the where the waistline is, so that
Mhm.
so that you had them at the same level at the waist, and then let them do whatever they need to do above and below.
Yeah, that was my thought too. That's the easiest way to do it. Because
Yeah.
I'll
Yeah.
have a yard left over if I do it that way, which is more than, and it's 54 wide, so that's way more than enough I need for a corset.
Yeah.
Until you
I
start pattern matching. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. I think that's really good advice, but also for those of you who are listening in and like, what is this pattern matching nonsense? Always plan more fabric for your pattern matching. You will always need excess. It's a very fabric intensive choice, but the rewards visually can be high. So I usually just do pattern matching for things where I feel like the visual impact will be worth it. So yeah, but I like it. I just am strategic about it. Okay, so now I'm going to take you across the workshop. We're going to go for a little seafaring trip. I'm going to actually move my tea and my sewing stuff first, and then I'll come back for you. So if you get motion sick or anything like that, please look away when I start the movement, because it will rock and roll. And I warn you guys about this every time, because there have been people who attend our workshops who do get motion sick from this motion. So if you don't, I'm happy for you. If you do, I'm sad that I'm making you motion sick, and that's why I warn you. Okay, here we go. Across the workshop.
I went and dug out my half-assed pattern matched corset that I made. I don't think you're the point. I don't think you were talking about me because mine's only half-assed.
I'm going to spotlight you so everyone can see. Oh my gosh. Wow, that's beautiful though.
So I had
Oh,
them. There were two different. Um, where's the front of this thing? There were two different patterns with. Um, oh,
oh, oh my gosh.
there were two different. What am I trying to say? Peacocks that
Mm.
kind of matched up
Oh,
because I was
stunning.
using scraps. So and this is actually what I should be doing instead of. Oh, never mind. I didn't finish that.
No
Anyway,
shoulds. No shoulds. You're doing great.
no,
Um,
I made this class. This class ended the day before the pandemic.
oh my
Closed
gosh.
everything in Wisconsin. So I didn't get my. I have one grommet and no other grommets.
You know what? Honestly, you did a lovely job on the pattern matching. It's
I pattern
very
matched the
pretty.
inside too.
Ooh, look at that beautiful interior. Sorry, I removed the spotlight too soon. Will you
That's
show
okay.
us the interior again, Martha?
So this is a. The class was like a fashion corset kind of class,
Mm,
and I couldn't
very
decide
pretty.
what fabric to use. So I have bustles um, in both of these fabrics. So
Oh, I
this one
love that.
actually
Very pretty.
I did pattern match the whole inside.
But also, I love the way you arranged your peacocks so they're sort of like facing and talking to each other. I think it
Yeah.
turned out really
There's
pretty.
beginning pattern matching and then there's expert. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
I,
mean, I guess
I
if I was doing Alicia's one, I would match above the waist because depending on where you're going to wear it, like if you're going to wear it outside like a for a steampunk thing, but you have a skirt on over it, you're only going to see from the waist up.
mm,
But if you wear it over the whole thing, right, then matching at the waist would probably be the best option, certainly the easier option.
yeah. I think again, this is one of those where you have to like judge by the project and by the
Yeah.
fabric.
Yeah.
Um, if I do not give this cat a treat, he's going to lose his minds.
Yeah.
And
But
that means giving one to Masala as well. There you go.
uh-oh, somebody heard the word treat.
Oh dear. I will start spelling for everybody's cats. So, pattern matching is a whole thing, and I haven't really done a class or a workshop on it, and maybe I'll just do a thing where we focus on pattern matching. It's something where I find it gets better with practice, easier with practice. You also figure out the methods that work for you because there are a lot of ways to approach it, like just about everything in sewing. And I'm not trying to ever be modest or like false modesty or false humility. It's just that I'm aware that my method of doing things is not the ultimate option, that there are lots of ways of approaching things. I'm just always sharing the things that I have found work best for me, that are time savers, that I like, because I'm not going to hoard my knowledge either. So that's where I'm at. Okay. So, mm, one of my choices when I was getting, searching the pieces is I decided to like do a wild array of colors for the serger because it's a rainbow uh, setup. Just picking one color was very hard. And then I was like, why choose? It's a rainbow. I can have all the colors. And so what I actually did was I picked a bunch of coordinating colors that are things from projects in the past where I just don't use those colors very often. And so I could use them up a little bit for this. But for sewing this seam, I'm actually just using some purple thread because that's what's on the machine. When I go in and do my top stitching for my channels, I am a fool and I'm going to be using rainbow thread again, like a crazy woman. But I love the way this rainbow thread looks with the rainbow design. I think it's really sharp and I've got it, so I might as well use it. I also cut and prepared a bunch of hot pink bias to make tape out of. And we'll probably talk about this at least a little bit before we wrap up today, because I made a somewhat ridiculous mistake when I was cutting and prepping this. I made it too wide. So it's not the worst problem to have, but I cut it and prepped it like I was making a corset. So I cut it wide enough to bind a corset rather than like prepping it for doing these boning channels. So I'll probably have to mess with that a bit. I could cut that bias in half and have the right width, but I don't want to. That's too much effort and I am lazy. So if you're laughing at me, that's actually what I want you to be doing. So
Okay.
thank you for laughing with me about this. Yes.
So what was your goal to cut 1-inch ones instead?
So I meant to have a finished width of like a 1/2 inch. And so my plan was to do yeah, like 1.5 inches, because you want a 1/2 inch to fold under from both sides. But instead I cut 2 1/4 inch wide, which is what I do when I'm binding the edge of my corsets to account for the thickness of the turn, as well as like the like I like to do a 1/2 inch binding on my corset edges. You can do a narrower binding, but I normally do 1/2 inch. So yeah, it's just like a little bit too wide, but I'm going to work with it and I'm going to talk about how I approach that, and I'm just gonna make lemonade out of lemons. So it's not the worst mistake I could have made, but it is absolutely a mistake. So I see we have a
Thought I
baby
was all
cat.
set with my pre-purchased 1-inch bias tape because it said
Mm.
extra wide. So
Yeah.
now I'm gonna have to like find a coordinating fabric and make my own.
Yes. Okay. So yeah.
Extra wide's 1 inch, right? Anyway,
Extra wide's 1 inch, and so single fold is 1 inch, and the edges, just the edges are folded under. Double fold is like where it's folded in half again. And actually, I like the double fold because it makes for a very nice firm boning channel for this project, and I like that. But you can get away with the single folds, so you don't have to have the double fold. Um, she's on their website, the Truly Victorian website, they have been selling bone casing tape, which I'll pull some out and talk to you about it and show you what it looks like. That is something we will talk more about in the corsetry class later on this year, but it's a very handy, notion to have if you're going to do boning channels. It's sort of like does a lot of the math and the heavy lifting for you. But it's typically white or black. You can dye the white to be whatever color you want, but I didn't want to do any dyeing right now. So like I'm gonna make my own bias, right?
well, and with
Okay.
the way this is constructed, you'd be cutting off your boning channels at the end and not have a way to put the bones in and out. So it's not really,
Right. It's not the ideal.
yeah.
You can do it, but it will make your life more difficult. So I like the bias. But you know what? If you want to use the casing tape, you can make it work. So I am going to be sewing using a 2.5 millimeter stitch, a straight stitch. This is a fairly, lightweight, not super lightweight fabric. It's not flimsy, it's Kona cotton, but I don't need a heavy duty needle. So I'm just using like a size 12 needle that I just swapped out. So it's a pretty fresh needle also. As an aside, you should be changing your needles somewhat regularly, typically every 8 hours of sewing time, not every 8 hours that it lives in your sewing machine doing nothing, but every 8 hours of sewing time. For me, I normally just swap out at the end of projects because I'm pretty sure, or at the end of garments, because I'm like, I've definitely put 8 hours in. It's time to swap my needles. All of the seam allowances here are 1/2 inch wide, which is partially why it kind of threw me for a loop that the markings for that boning channel are 5/8 inches wide, because I'm used to her using everything in 1/2 inches. But sometimes you trust the process and it will work out. Okay. So this is simple sewing. It's just a regular old seam, nothing fussy here, but you do want to make sure everything is lined up. So I do recommend clipping things with your Wonder Clips or pinning lightly. I don't think you have to pin heavily for this unless you're doing something wild and doing pattern matching on your bustle cage. Of course, I'm going to do a little back tack here. In general, you won't have to worry about seams. You'll have like a continuous piece of fabric that you haven't pieced. But if you do any piecing, make sure your seams and their little seam allowance stay nice and smooth and flat. It will just be a nicer finished garment and it will wear a little nicer. I definitely have to pull my pins out as I'm going through because that crossed X of pins will break a needle. It just will. It's not a good idea to try and run your needle over that. It's too much metal. So as I come up to where I have my little pins, I pull them out. I do try and keep the edge of my fabric right on that 1/2 inch mark the whole time. I want my seam to be pretty standard. I'm not super fussy here, but I find that accuracy matters. And so I do my best to be fairly accurate all the time. And it's one of those things where I find practicing accuracy means that it starts to become second nature as I'm sewing other things. That said, we're not robots. We're not AI. We are human beings. So nothing is ever going to be perfect. Perfect is boring anyway. You're just trying to be consistent and have everything be sort of close. When I get to the end of my seam, just going to do a little back tack for myself. It's a really, you just do a nice long seam. You don't have to worry too much about the directionality of how you're sewing because the tension on this seam is not going to impact the other elements of the bustle. When you get into putting in the wings and putting in the bum pad and all of that, I tend to at that point make sure I'm always sewing in the same direction so that the tension is the same across those pieces. But I'm not worried about it on this back seam. Okay, come on, little thing. You're gonna have to stare at the sewing machine for a little bit longer. There we go. My swing arm did not want to loosen up so I could see your faces again. So now that we've sewn this, oh, and my cat is lying on it. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna actually clip the seam and we're gonna go press it. I think it's really important to press at this point because it will be harder to do later on. And I like to press this seam open because it makes it a little bit smoother to get my boning in. Now, here's the thing. You can put your channels on the bottom side, or you can put them on the top. Regardless of which side I put my boning channels on, I actually go in and I top stitch this seam open and flat because I do not want it to get bulky and bunchy under my channel tape or under my bias tape. And I don't, if I am running my bones on the underside, I don't want this to be all wonky and bunchy and catching up on my bones. So I make sure that not only do I press it flat after I've clipped it, but then I stitch it in place so it is really going nowhere. That is my extra step that I do for my personal sanity. I think it also sort of strengthens the bustle cage so that this seam is a little bit reinforced. It's not under a lot of strain, but it is according in and out every time you sit in it and every time you wear it. And so reinforcing it a little bit is not a bad idea either. All right, now is the time where I make some folks uncomfortable. I tend to clip my seams just with my big scissors. Some people prefer to use small scissors to do this with a smaller blade. Honestly, you should use the tool that is comfortable and works for you. When I'm clipping my seams, I use just the little tiniest tip of my scissors. So I just go in there with a little bit of scissor. I don't go in with the deep in the mouth of my scissor. I'm working here on the outer edge. Okay. Make sure not to snip through your stitches. That'll be really sad. And I'm just going to snip all the way along the curve and almost all the way down the seam since almost the whole thing is curved. Once I get about 2/3 of the way down, it starts to be fairly flat and straight. And so I don't typically clip there. Or if I do clip, the clips are pretty far apart. But up here in this upper portion of the curve, I'm usually clipping every 1/2 inch, give or take. I've had people ask me before exactly the ratio of my clips. And it's the honest answer is it's vibes. I clip as far apart or as close together as feels right for the curve. And some of that comes with practice. So I don't know if there's a perfect like ratio of clip to curve out there in the universe. I haven't seen it in a book. That doesn't mean it isn't there, but I go by vibes. So you guys should know I'm not actually measuring the ratio between my clips with anything more than my eyes and my heart. I do want to get clipped in pretty close to my stitches, but again, be careful not to go all the way through. And you just want to have a nice little notch there, essentially, so that when you go in and press, you'll be able to get a nice smooth curve. I'm going to be pressing this over my tailor's ham. which is something I do anytime I am pressing in this kind of curve. If you've taken my corsetry class, you know that I'm a huge advocate for having a tailor's ham in your workshop. I think it really levels up your pressing and therefore your sewing like almost no other tool. A seam roll is also good. If you don't have a tailor's ham, and I didn't when I was first starting to sew, I didn't even know why I'd need one. I didn't know what they were for. But if you don't have one, you can always roll up a towel nice and firm into a good curve for yourself, into a base for your curve, and it will get you through. I've shown how to do this in hat making. I've shown how to do that in corset making. It's just like sometimes you want to do the thing and you don't want to invest in every tool under the sun to do the thing. Okay. And sometimes you just want to make sure you actually like doing that kind of sewing before you invest in those sorts of tools, right? So I've gone in, I've notched everything. It's ready for pressing. We're going to go over to the ironing table and we're going to do a little pressing over that tailor's ham, and then we'll come back and we'll do some top stitching. And I'll probably curse a lot with the top stitching because it requires me to adjust the tension and do all of this nonsense to get it positioned appropriately. And invariably, it takes me a while to figure out what the tension needs to be and where it needs to be positioned. Okay, so let's go to the ironing table. So I'm really fortunate. I'm using a wonderful cotton fabric, so I can use a hot, steamy iron. I don't have to be too precious with my iron, but you may want to use a pressing cloth, even so, because we're going to do a lot of pressing, and even cotton can get a little bit of scorch. I just use scraps for my pressing cloth, so I usually have some scraps of silk organza kicking around in my workshop since I like to use it for certain kinds of interfacing. So I usually have enough that I can use it as my pressing cloth rather than buying a special pressing cloth. But you can find ready-made pressing cloths at all of the big Sewing Notions supply stores. So, and usually they have some at Joann's, although the last one a friend bought at Joann's actually melted on them under their iron, which was like the most shocking thing. That is absolutely not what your pressing cloth should do. So I would very carefully check the packaging for what the fiber is, because your pressing cloth should be able to handle all the heat and all the steam, and not melt on you and ruin your garment because the pressing cloth melted. So have
I use an old sheet. It
yes.
was back in the days when the sheets were percale, I think.
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's better than more modern sheets. So
Oh.
that's what I use. I really like it.
Oh man. Yeah, as an aside, if you've been around for a while, you know that there's fabric that just doesn't get made anymore, or it's very rare and it used to be super common. It's not your imagination. It's really true. There's some fabric that doesn't get made anymore. It wasn't used enough, or people in society were like, we could use something chintzier and most people won't know because they don't know fabric, and sewists are over here in a corner crying because it was a great fabric and it made things last longer, so you weren't putting more stuff in, I don't know, the landfill. That's my Earth Day rant for now. Okay. So I've got my wonderful vintage Taylor's ham. When this one gets too flattened out, I will just open it up and restuff it, honestly, because I love it so much. But I may ultimately take a pattern from this because it is bigger than the standard Taylor's ham that you get from Joann's. And honestly, the larger size is better. Not necessarily obsessed with size, but for this, the larger size is better.
If that's a ham, shouldn't a sleeve roll be a sausage?
It should totally be a sausage. I
Yeah.
don't know why it's not.
That's what I've always called it.
Totally a sausage. So I have both a fabric roll, and this you can get this at your normal Notions places, Wawak, Joann's, what have you. But I also have one of these guys that is very handy. And then I'm fortunate that I have one of these. So you can use these in similar ways to work on those seams and like help press them open. But they're basically all like subsets of the same tool doing similar jobs. But the Taylor's ham, this is a special boy, and it's like a multi-use tool. It's like I don't know, it's like the Leatherman of the sewing workshop. I also have a little ham holder. This one was from Walmart and it's made out of particle board and it was $20. It's very sufficient. That's what I would say. I have had to tighten the screws periodically on this one. So it's like a little bit loose. A hardwood one is probably going to be more sturdy, but I don't think you need to invest in fancy wood. The particle board will get you by and hold well enough. You just need to know how to tighten up these screws on the bottom. Now, my curves for this are not super, super extreme, but they are enough that having my ham holder is going to help. And you want to find the curve of your tailor's ham that is right for the curve of your garment. So normally that takes me a few, like moving it around, adjusting it until I found the curve. And usually I will have to adjust again as I'm proceeding down that curve as the shape of the curve adjusts or changes. I do find that when I'm demoing ironing on the tailor's ham, that the big trick is I'm usually ironing opposite how I normally would for myself so that you guys can see what I'm doing. I want you to see and also not to burn myself. So I open up my seam. Try not to burn yourself. I'm just going to go in and press it open. If it's being really recalcitrant and it doesn't want to take the press, and I need to go over it and reinforce it and steam it, and I'm worried I'm going to give it some shine, then I'm going to put my little pressing cloth in place. Really get in there with nice steam. You can also take your sausage and hold it on top like a clapper to help reflect the heat into your fabric and into the tailor's ham. Or if you have a clapper, use the clapper, right? You just want that curve to get nice and firm. You don't have to let it be bone cold before you move on, but I like to let things set for a second because then the pressing kind of firms up. And again, I'm just sort of like checking out, moving the fabric around on my ham, shifting my ham as I need to to make sure I'm supporting that curve and opening it up. And honestly, the part where I used a little clapping action is taking the press better. So I'm just going to go in and like reflect the heat for a second and let it get nice and flat. The way I know that I've got my fabric positioned appropriately on the curve is that it will fall open pretty easily and the seam will be flat to the tailor's ham. So if it's like sticking up a bit like this, I haven't quite got it seated. So I'm just gonna shift it around until I've got that position appropriate. Sometimes I need to move up on my ham. Sometimes I need to just shift the angle of the ham a little bit. There's some sort of like math, calculus, geometry thing going on here. But we're sewists, we do applied math. We're kind of like fiber engineers, right? So once I'm satisfied that I've got it in a good position, sometimes I'll check by just going in with my fingers and, you know, opening up that seam a little bit. Then I go in again, press it. I'm just gonna sort of low-key clapping because I'm not grabbing the actual clapper, partly because I didn't put it in an easy to reach position. So, but this does the trick, as you can see. It still reflects the heat and helps smooth out that seam. As an aside, I didn't own a clapper until like the pandemic. And when I first got one, I was unsure how to use it. And I'm very grateful to everyone who had experience with a clapper and sort of showed me the way. Because it does. It's a really nice tool and it makes a big difference. Not essential. If you don't have one, you can make do without it, but it absolutely ups the quality of my pressing. Now let's sit there for a second. So once I have this all pressed, we'll talk about top stitching. We'll talk about adjusting tension. I should be checking the time. We've got a little bit longer together. We'll probably finish at about 8 p.m. Pacific time, as it starts to get very late for everybody else. And part of the reason we're starting at 5:30 is so we're not going until infinite hours at night, because I know that for those of you who are east of us, that it's already quite late. So I don't know if you can see how I'm moving the tailor's ham and I'm moving the fabric around, but I'm doing it kind of constantly through this process. Every time I put the iron down, I'm kind of shifting things for the next segment of the curve before I press it. Okay, almost done with our pressing. I will go through and press from the outside as well, because again, I want this to be a nice, crisp pressed seam. I am going to top stitch it, which will help hold that crispness, but everything I'm doing here is just to make sure that the boning channels go in smoothly and it's easy for me to get my bones in. at the end of this process. It's not just to be fussy, although I do that sometimes. All right, last segment, and then we're gonna flop it over and do the other side. And basically it's a repeat of the process we just did. And one of the things Cindy asked me on Sunday, which was a great question, was, will I go in and stretch my bias before I stitch it in place using the iron? And with things like doing the binding on the edge of my corset that's really curvy, or putting boning channels into a corset, I may do that because it's so curvy and I want it to be nice and smooth. With something like this, the curve is very minor, and normally I'm able to just like whoosh it into position under the needle on my machine, and the bias will maneuver enough for me without the addition of heat. But the more pronounced your curve is, the more useful it is to press that curve into position before you're trying to stitch it. I've skipped doing this with a corset before, and I regretted it so much. I usually try not to skip it in corsetry. You can skip doing this level of fussy pressing for something like this, and it's not going to make you miserable, but I think that the finished product is so much nicer if you take the time. Okay. So now this is nice, pressed, very smooth, crisp, ready for top stitching. So I have this beautiful rainbow ombre top stitching thread from Wawak. It's great. I love it. It is a heavier weight thread because it is top stitching thread. And so when I use it, I do need to be sure that I'm using a top stitching needle. And I have to use it on a thread stand that I need to position around my machine. Now, this means there's a lot more trial and error getting the tension dialed in. I'm going to do a little bit of it, at least so I can demonstrate for you guys how to do that process in case you ever also want to use top stitching thread for something. I'll be probably top stitching the entire set of boning channels with this rainbow ombre thread because that's what I did for the corset and I kind of want them to match. But rest assured that I'm making the job for myself harder than it needs to be. You don't need to use top stitch thread for this. You do not need to go to this kind of fussy extreme. I'm making an aesthetic choice. You can use your regular all-purpose machine sewing thread for this. It's not denim. It's not twill. Even if you're using twill, you're probably not doing a flat felled seam, so it's still not super thick fabric here. You can use your regular everyday all-purpose thread. So again, this is like an aesthetic decision I decided to make because I like to suffer, I guess. So it's worth it when I'm done. Also, look at how nice that curve is now that it's been pressed. That's what you want. You want a nice smooth curve here at the back of your bustle because you want a nice curved shape for your bustle anyway. That curve, this particular curve right here is really the one that gives you that signature hump that is just below your waist over where your posterior is hiding under all of these layers of fabric that gives you the loft in your bustle skirts. So you don't want this to be too flat or too angular because you want a nice soft curve. Even though we're trying to look like we're centaurs, we want to be smooth, streamlined centaurs. Okay. So, all right. Let's go back across to the sewing machine. And the cat, who is like happily napping right next to the machine. Hi, Cake. Okay. So for anyone who hasn't ever seen one, this is a thread stand. It's very helpful for large cones of thread that you want to run through your normal machine. It can also be helpful with vintage machines where you're not sure that the tension on your spool is right for the kind of machine, or the way the spool is wound is going to work for your vintage machine. Sometimes you need to use a thread stand. Usually I line my thread stand up behind my machine and then I thread it somewhat like normal. But the amount of space between the back of my machine and the thread stand can also affect the tension. So I have to get it positioned kind of just so for my machine. I did all sorts of things with the corset because every boning channel that I put in actually needed slight adjustments on the thread tension. It was the most fussy stitching I have ever done, and I constantly question my life choices, but it turned out nice. So keep that in mind if you're gonna use a thread stand or any like unusual weight thread. You're going to have to pay more attention to your tension than usual. What I have found is with the top stitching thread, I need to take my tension down. So I need it to be a little bit looser. I don't typically need to adjust the tension on my bobbin, just the upper thread. I think this is a question that came up for one of our projects together. Somebody asked me what the difference was in the top stitching needle versus a standard needle. And the real difference is that the eye is wider in your top stitching needle. You want that wider eye so it doesn't chew up your thread. Okay, top stitching needles. Where did I put you? Now that I've talked you up. There you are. Ever since the pandemic, I keep a huge hoard of needles on hand in a way that I did not do before that. And part of it is I still remember that moment when anything made out of metal was like very hard to come by. And there was like a sewing needle shortage for a little while. We were all sort of trying to get each other sewing needles to do all of this like mask making and everything else. And so now I'm like paranoid that I will run out of sewing needles. I may never run out of sewing needles. I have so many. I certainly won't run out for the next 2 years. So, All right. So I don't know if you'll be able to see. The screen just does not uh have enough like detail, but that is a top stitching needle. To me, the eye is wildly larger and very noticeable in person. So, but in all other regards, it looks essentially the same as a normal needle. So the normal needle is here, the top stitching needle is here. They look roughly the same. The only difference is the size of the eye. You're going to use it in your machine in the same way. Thread as normal, essentially, unless you have special instructions for your machine when it comes to using a thread stand. Follow those instructions. Just throw my thread on the floor, that'll be fine. Okay. Oh my gosh. In the few minutes I was pulling out my needle, Cake managed to unthread the thread from the thread stand because he's magical. You do want to use a normal thread in your bobbin. So the top stitch thread is kind of a heavier weight, it's thicker. You're just going to use your standard all-purpose thread in your bobbin. All right. And now I'm just going to go check my tension. Currently, I'm guessing on the tension I need. I'm going to give it a try, see how it goes. I may need to like deal with some jams or with skip stitches or not nice looking stitches and start over. I'm just sort of like accepting that that's part of the process. But please know it's because I'm using the top stitching thread and there's just a little bit of adjustment that goes with that. And again, you don't need to use top stitching thread. I know I've said that like 5 million times at this point. I just want to reassure you, you don't have to suffer. You may choose to suffer with me if you want to, and I welcome you to join me in suffering, but you don't have to suffer. Okay. So the other thing I do if I'm going to do a nice top stitch is I increase the length of my stitch. And in this case, I'm increasing it to 3 millimeters. Sometimes I go up to 4. That's the longest stitch length I have on my machine. Some machines will go up to 6 millimeter stitch length. Amazing. I don't know if there are any that do bigger than that. Okay. So I've got my little seam here, and I want to be on the side of my seam. I'm not trying to repeat the seam, so I don't want to center my needle. I'm going to line my presser foot up with the edge of my seam, and I can choose like how far I want to go over for my top stitching. Do I want to do 1/8 of an inch? Do I want to do 1/4 of an inch? I'm setting mine up to be about 1/8 of an inch, which is like in the middle of my seam allowance-ish. Well, yeah, not quite, but it's within that seam allowance, right? I don't want to go outside the seam allowance because my goal is to catch the seam below and reinforce this seam and keep the edges of my seam allowance nice and flat to the garment. Okay. Drop my needle. So far, so good. I'm going to give myself a little back tack. I could probably skip the back tack because this is going to be buried into my waistband, but it's going to be a little while before I put the waistband on. So I'm going to have the back tack to keep this top stitching in place so it's not going to go anywhere while I'm processing the garment. While I'm doing this, I'm keeping my seam here lined up with this little ridge on my presser foot, and that will keep it kind of even as I'm going down the seam. With this, slow and steady is a good idea, and I'm also taking a moment to look at how those stitches are looking, and honestly, they look great. Fingers crossed, everybody. All of my pain and suffering with the corset paid off. Because now I've got a great sense of how to set up this top stitching thread. Oh, I'm in love. I love how it looks. So good. Now you're going to see the one place where my seams don't perfectly match. And once we're all done, no one will ever know except for y'all and me. So pretty. Worth the extra effort. Clearly, I've got some little threads I need to snip. Okay. When I get to the bottom here, I'm also going to give myself a little back tack for the same reason as on the top of the garment, mostly because I need it to hold long enough for me to finish the garment. And I don't want my top stitching to come out. So I am very pleased with how that looks. It's pretty smooth, pretty straight. There are only a couple of little bobbles, but all the stitches look really nice and it's sharp. And I love that. So now to do the other side. Oops. I'm going to essentially find the symmetrical opposite on my presser foot and line that up now with the center seam and repeat the process. Oh, I spoke too soon. I said a lot of nice things. I just had a jam in my machine. So we're going to take a moment while I undo that jam. I said too many nice things to the sewing machine and now it feels cheeky. Okay, that happens. So again, the top stitching is like a little bit fussier. I got away with doing that whole seam without any problems, and now it's like, how about we have a little snarl in the back. So I'm just gonna take out the bobbin, clean out the bobbin area, and really that takes care of these problems, especially since the tension worked really well on the other side. I don't really think it's a tension problem. I think it's just that my sewing machine would really like to be serviced. So, and I'm waiting until I go to Louisville to take it in to be serviced because I'll be gone for 2 weeks. So I'm like, that's the time. I can't sew. I'll be out of town. Does anybody else do that? Do you wait until you like are gone and you can't possibly sew before you're willing to part with your machine? I've
Yes.
got like 4 machines in my workshop that I could use. I don't have to have this one. It's just that this is my daily driver that I use all the time. I'm so comfortable with it. And I love using this machine for teaching because I'm so comfortable with it. I'm never worried that something's going to happen that's weird with the machine in the middle of class that I can't resolve easily. And I like not being derailed by the machine, right? Oops. The other thing is here anyway, because winter is the season of people coming to visit who don't live here. 100% of the time, they only live here for the winter months. Winter season sees a bigger influx of people who sew, and all of our machine shops have a terrible backlog in the winter months to take it in to get it serviced. And so it's really good to wait until late spring, early summer when it's starting to get really hot here because all of the people who like live here part-time leave. They flee for some place that has more reasonable weather. And then the shops are like, yeah, no, we can get you in. Everybody left. We're actually desperate for business. So I try and get this done in June typically. If I'm not sewing for costume college, that is. Dun dun dun. Cindy, are you going to costume college this year?
I am not going to costume college this year. It's
Oh, nice.
yeah, that's the way
And
things work. I have a convention locally the middle weekend of July,
Mm,
and
it's too much.
my family wants to go on vacation.
What?
Yeah. So
Madness.
and yeah, and the local schools are on this balanced calendar junk where the summer is like 6 weeks.
Oh, wow.
It's
Wow.
yeah. So they get more breaks during the school year and it shortens the summer to the point where it's just stupid. So, and
Oh my
6 weeks
God.
may be an exaggeration.
I got you. Oh, wow. Yeah, I know I can't do costume college every year. If I could, I would, honestly.
Yeah.
I have a wonderful time. But and I agree with Joanne because we talked about this a couple of weeks ago that it's a great deal for the money, but it is still a significant,
It's a lot of money.
right? So
Well,
it
and
is
I went as a vendor last year,
a,
and it's less expensive to be there as a vendor than it is to be there as a participant.
well, that's on one hand, that's great. That's great.
Except the vendor badge, unlike every other convention, the vendor badge only gets you into the vendor room. It does not
Ah,
let you nip out for even half a second and go do anything else or do the evening things or anything. Even though I
oh,
did just like go walk into them, but
yeah. Oh, that's a bummer. Yeah,
yeah,
especially the evening things are really nice, the social and everything.
well,
Okay.
unless I'm taking a class that I need my machine for at costume college, I always take my machine in for service during costume college because I have to pass my favorite machine repair store on my way to
Oh.
LA. And then I can pick it up coming back. And even if it's not ready, they have a really clean bathroom. So
That's nice.
it's a nice stop.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we're spoiled for choice here in Tucson. I definitely have this advantage because I know you have to like drive away from your home base to get to a place,
Fresno.
right? Fresno, an hour away. But we've got actually quite a few like quite a few, I'd say a handful of really delightful places you can take your sewing machines here. And so I feel really fortunate. But of course, you develop your favorite, even if there are a number of good ones.
Yeah. Well, and you can thank the snowbirds for that.
I sure can. I was trying to be polite about it, but it's true. That is
Okay.
exactly it.
Yeah.
So Jake and I once, we couldn't get into our favorite RV park in Phoenix for to go to the Arizona Renaissance Festival. And we got into this one that was so fancy that they actually give tours.
Oh my
And
God.
they have craft rooms for every craft, including a sewing room where they have an embroidery machine, but you have to be checked out on the embroidery machine. They had a lapidary room and everything. We haven't stayed there since because we have a favorite place in Apache
Right.
Junction. But it was amazing. But I'm sure they have to bring their machines in because they provide the machines and the embroidery machine
Yeah.
in their sewing room. So I was thinking of that.
Oh man. Yeah. Winter is not the time for them to take their machines in for service. Okay. So cleaning out the bobbin carriage. This is why I know it really needs to go in and be serviced. Just need me to clean out the bobbin carriage and rethread it. It's working beautifully. Let me show you how I've lined this up and how I'm stitching the opposite side so that I have a fairly symmetrical top stitching on either side. You could do this with a double needle. I am going to be honest, I don't know if there's a double needle for top stitching. I assume there is. They haven't looked into it. You'd need an extra like thread holder potentially, and you'd have to do like some really fancy threading to do a double needle with top stitching. That's like more than I want to do. So I'm using my skills to create the effect of double stitching by stitching a row at a time without the double needle. So if you're using all-purpose thread and you're comfortable with a double needle, you could definitely do this effect with a double needle. So again, I've lined my center seam up with the symmetrical seam on my presser foot on the opposite side, so left versus right. And I'm just using that as my guide so this stays pretty visually even. Don't go in with calipers. This is not good enough for creating a rocket or any spacesuits, but it will be perfect for this project. And then I have just this beautiful rainbow effect going on everywhere in the garment. It's rainbows on rainbows on rainbows.
You just need a couple unicorn appliques to finish it off.
Girl, you are not wrong. That is absolutely true. And now
On the cotton batiste in front, it would be perfect.
I have time to get unicorn appliques.
Yeah, you do.
Well, thanks for giving me ideas. I love that.
You're welcome.
That's a great suggestion, and now I'm going to do it.
Can't wait to see it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. All right, so now this is all stitched in place. I'm very happy with how that looks. Like I said, there are a few bobbles that happens. No one's going to really go in and look that closely. I just want it to be mostly visually satisfying and pretty even. But the big thing is also my stitches are nice and clean. The tension is good. The top stitch thread is doing what it's supposed to do. So I'm very happy with how that turned out.
Was that
And
like a quarter inch?
yeah, it's like yeah, it's between an eighth and a quarter inch from the center seam. And I could go in there with a seam gauge and give you an exact measurement. But the big thing is it's just inside my seam allowance. So my little edges are stitched down nice and flat on the inside. So whether I'm putting my boning channels on the outside or the inside of my garment, this is going to be nice and smooth when I sew over it, and it's not going to get lumpy or twisted or bunched up or anything under the boning channel. And that's really the reason I do this top stitching, is to keep this nice and smooth while I'm putting in the boning channels. And I want it smooth so I'm not getting those lumps, so I don't have a weird roadblock in getting my bones into those boning channels. Like, long-term strategic plan there. The advantage is that you get like a little bit of extra decorative stitching on your garment. Now, if you have got a decorative stitch or you've got embroidery, you could absolutely embroider down this center back seam. You could be very fancy. You could cover it in trim. You could do a dozen different things that would be very attractive. I am just like repeating what I did in my corset, which is to have this rainbow top stitching. But typically when I do my bustle cages, I just do whatever thread color I've done for the rest of the bustle. I do it in this double stitched back seam. So that is the main brunt of doing the back. Now we're going to be putting in our boning channels next session on Sunday. You may need to like consider when you're going to put your marks into your panel relative to when you are going to sew in those channels. I'll probably have to go in and clean up some of my marks because all of this handling has sort of rubbed them off in a few spots, but there's enough left that I can go clean it up and reinforce my marks. When I'm not doing this for a class, I would go immediately from this point into putting my boning channels in, so I wouldn't be too worried about it, but it's going to lie fallow for a few days until we're in class. So I will want to, check on my marks, make sure they're still nice and visible so I can work with them when we are together again. Check. I'm not going to set up my bias and press it tonight live, but I want to talk a little bit about my approach here. Typically, with a corset, I don't go and use a bias tape attachment and press it. I just do it in stages and press as I go. But for this, it will be helpful to press under my raw edges and prep this so I'm not trying to like slowly press this into position as I'm stitching it. That would be really tedious. I do have a bias tape maker, so I'll probably use that, and I may demo that in class to show you how to use it. Ideally, I would not have cut this twice as wide as I needed it to be, or almost. So I've made mine of a dimension where I could just about create double folds instead of single. And I may do that with this rather than cut it down. But you just want to make sure that your bias tape is wide enough that you can press under your edges, the raw edges, and kind of have them wrap under where the bone would be and still have it end up being at least a 1/2 inch to 5/8 inch wide. You don't really want it wider than 5/8 of an inch. That's going to be too wide for the bones, but you want it. I typically am shooting for a 1/2 inch wide on mine. So, yeah. All right. Any questions before we wrap up tonight?
So did you say that the width that you intended to cut the bias was 1.25 inches?
Let's see,
Or
let's see,
1 inch
and a half, an
an
inch
inch
and a half.
and a half?
And I did 2 1/4 because I was like, and that's so fussy to cut off 3/4 of an inch of this
Oh my
bias, and I
God.
just don't want to do it.
Well, and then it's not useful. The piece you have left is not useful.
It's not. So I'm
So
just gonna press it into submission. But
you can make some double piping out of that. And
oh, yeah, right? Yes, all sorts of things. I could cut more bias, but I don't want to go and get more fabric. I just want to use what I've got. So I'm going to
Okay.
make it work. But if you're cutting your own, the finished width that you want is a 1/2 inch wide. So typically you just need a 1/2 inch seam allowance on either side of that. So that's 1.5 inches. Um, if you're a very fancy presser, you can do a 1/4 inch seam allowance on either side. I'm not that fancy, y'all. I need that 1/2 inch. It's a little easier to work with than a 1/4 inch, and I'm less likely to burn my fingers. Let
So you're
me,
so you're folding it sort of in thirds then? So there's not like a little space down the middle?
no, not for me.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I overlap the stuff in the back. So I've got a nice sort of channel for my bone to go through,
Okay.
if that makes
And,
sense.
and you're because I do have one of those bias tape makers,
Mhm.
but I don't think it folds it in thirds.
It does not. It usually folds
Oh,
it like with I'm not mathing very well in my head, or I'm not articulating the math right now very well, but it's sort of, you'll get your finished width. Let's say you have like an inch wide, and then it will fold under a 1/2 inch on either side. So you've got like a little opening down the center. So
uh-huh.
if you're doing a 1/2 inch wide, then it'll fold under like a 1/4 inch, right? So
Right.
it does have that little opening. I wanted to have like it wrap around my um bone because I want the channel to be kind of strong so that the bone does not wear through my fabric. And part of this is because I wear my bustles a lot, and I wear them with everything that I do for costumes, or like 90% of my costumes. And I have actually had my bones wear through my boning channels. So I like to make them nice and strong. Um, but I also clearly did my math wrong when I was cutting this out. So, sometimes I too get confused in my proportions, or I'm tired, or whatever was going on, honestly. So I
I
think
was
I
just
just,
trying to logistically figure out the folding part of it.
yeah, yeah, no, it's a good question, Martha. I'm gonna get up for a minute and go grab some ready-made bias tape and some boning channel tape so I can show you guys what those look like. We can talk about those options before we wrap up. Okay. Oh, she asked for, well, I'll get that in just a second. Okay. So this is boning channel tape. You can get it from most corsetry supply companies. And it is essentially a woven tape Wait. It has an opening down the center where you can run your boning channel, but it's complete and enclosed. And it has like this little groove on the side where you can stitch. And sometimes when people are doing something like this, rather than make their own channels using bias, they'll actually take this kind of thing and they'll wrap their bias around it. Very common in corset making, because then you get a nice consistent boning channel without having to make sure you've pressed and cut yours perfectly. It's also made out of twill, so it's very strong and your bones are unlikely to come through it. That's really important for corsetry. Cindy mentioned that this would be really hard to take your bones in and out of and to do any repairs. And you'd have to put your bones in before you finish the garment, which would be really tricky because the opening is only through the end and the ends get buried in the seam allowance. So this is not an ideal option for the bustle, but it is an option for your bustle. This is better for corset making, right? Or for doing a hoop skirt or a farthingale or something like that, where you are not burying the ends into a seam. But you can find it at Richard the Thread, corset making, and probably some other places that cater to corset makers. Okay. Now, this is what I normally use if I'm buying ready-made, which is clearly not what she called for in the pattern. And it may be why I had some like mental confusion when I was cutting my bias. So I normally get the double fold extra wide bias tape. And that, when it's folded open, this is what your single fold will look like. And it just has the raw edges folded under. Maybe I should not have grabbed black. It's a little hard to see. Folded under, and then there's like an opening down the center, and then you fold it in half again. And you have this little package that you can stitch on either side, and you make a nice little channel through which you can run your bone. Hold on. My bone fell on the floor. Come here, example bone. So last I checked, Truly Victorian was using the 1/4 inch bones for their hoop steels. A few years ago, proper hoop steel was like impossible to get. And a lot of places basically swapped over to regular spring steel corsetry boning. It like holds the shape, which is the big thing. As an aside, you can use heavy duty zip ties for this if you can't get a hold of metal. I don't like them because they're not that heavy. They're kind of lightweight. And so your bustle does not always drop because it doesn't have enough weight to it if you don't have the metal bones, has been my experience. If you put enough trim on it, if you have a heavy enough ruffle, you can maybe counteract that. The heavy duty zip ties will hold your shape enough for your bustle. They're a little flimsier than the metal, even the heavy duty zip ties. The synthetic whalebone would also work for this, but that's a very expensive option. It's more expensive than zip ties for sure. And it can be more expensive than the metal bones. I don't know if the price has come down on that. I haven't checked recently. So, but this 1/4 inch bone fits very neatly in my folded up package, whatever, I can't say the word. And so if I just edge stitch on either side of this bias, I've got a nice little channel for my bones. And it's strong because I've got fabric on either side. And so I like this method a lot. And this is one I have used regularly for creating this kind of channel for my bones. Let me go get the kind of bias tape that she calls for in the pattern so we can look at that. Hopefully I won't drop my bone this time. Okay. I don't use this kind of bias tape very often, so I don't have very much of it. I just have a little bit left on this card. This is a vintage bias tape that is a single fold bias tape, and you can see that you've got the little edges there. It's vintage and it's practically sheer. I would not trust this for making a body shape. I would trust it for something decorative. It may be nice and strong, but my goodness, I can see through it. So this is what the single fold looks like. You just have one fold with the raw edges folded back. I think she called for the wide, right? Which is twice as wide as this. And I think too wide for doing a channel for a bone that is a 1/4 inch wide. It could be that that is left over from the days when they actually got hoop steels
Oh, that could be.
instead of like the 1/4 inch bones. And the hoop steels are wider and they were wonderful, by the way. Um, Cindy, I'm assuming you've worked with them. I don't know if anyone else has. Hoop steel is hard to come by now.
Oh, yeah, I still have some. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, she calls for extra wide bias tape, which is
Right.
what really had me thrown.
Yeah.
Just
So
like,
I think
what?
it might be an artifact from, when you could get that hoop steel. And the hoop steel is like, it's more like a 1/2 inch wide bone, but instead of being spring steel entirely, it's like got these little rolls of spring steel at the edge and then almost like a polymer in the middle. It's a little bit hard to describe,
Oh,
but
I have
it's,
some of the buckram covered.
oh, yeah, oh, great. Excellent. I haven't had any in years. The last time I had some was like 6 or 7 years ago, and there was, I think, I think the rumor was that because Outlander was using so much hoop steel in creating their costumes for the court scenes, that there was like a run, or it was like the number of historical costume dramas that were coming out just Hollywood put a run on hoop steel, and we were all like, well, I guess we won't have hoop steel because Hollywood bought it all. And a lot of us swapped to doing our 1/4 inch bones. You could use the 1/2 inch steels, but I think that's more than you need. 1/4 inch will do it. So,
Yeah, I was just wondering, yeah, how strong that's going to be. Because I have uh, a lobster tail bustle that I had bought. I think it's regular size, not the imperial one, and it's
mhm,
definitely got that hoop steel in there.
yeah,
And it
the hoop
holds up
steel,
my skirts and stuff, right?
yeah, the
So,
hoop
but
steel was great. It was great.
but this is going to be sufficient.
This is what I use in all of mine, and it has done well. Um, so I haven't been like displeased with the effect. It is not as burly as the hoop steel, though. It's true. The hoop steel was really nice.
It just seems like there would be a weight limit. Like you can
Yeah.
only like no using of twill.
No, well, maybe not. Maybe not. Or I probably wouldn't like put three, layers of silk velvet skirts on top of it without doing some other stuff to, buoy the abundance of floof to sort of like give it the loft. But this has been able to hold up to my costumes anyway, and they're pretty heavy. So, Cindy, I'm gonna spotlight you so people can see this hoop steel. Okay. You're muted.
Okay. Yeah, my son came to close my door because
Yeah.
I didn't close it. Okay, so it just looks white on the camera, but if you look at the end, you can
Yes.
see the two steel things running through. And
Yeah.
this is actually a cotton, is that,
I can kind of see. Yeah, you can
yeah.
see the divot.
So you can see the divot, and it's a cotton buckram cover. It's not a plastic cover.
Mm. I think the kind I got years ago had a plastic cover. I like the cotton buckram
I've
better.
gotten it with a plastic cover on it too.
The
But
plastic will actually split on you, which is what happened ultimately with my hoop steels. I recycled them through 2 bustle cages, and after the second one, the plastic just, it wore out. But the steel lasted for a couple of years of
yeah,
heavy duty wear.
so I think so here's the plastic.
Thank you.
Here's
I
the
appreciate
plastic
that you've
cover
got
on it.
this. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me
It's
pull it
very
back down.
similar in style, but like the plastic will wear out in a way that cotton and buckram will not. So,
This is a lot
yeah.
of tape I put on here. Okay. Yeah, but you can see it's the same kind
Yeah.
of construction with the uh, with the
Yeah. The little
middle
double,
and the end and
the
the
divot in the middle.
yeah and it's just got metal along the edges and then it's plastic in the middle. And
Hmm.
I think it makes it a little bit more flexible while still being strong.
Yes.
I think is
Yes.
the purpose of that.
Thank you. Thank you, Cindy. Thanks for bringing that out so we could see it.
I had to dig into my drawer.
I
I do
appreciate
still
it.
I have some of the what they're selling now is hoop steel too. That's just
It's not the same.
yeah.
Yeah. It's not the
It's
same.
just a yeah. It's a
It's
little
just
bit yeah
it's regular spring
yeah.
steel for the
It's
most part.
it's a 1/2 inch.
Yeah.
It's not.
Um, let me see if I can get one of the truly Victorian kits.
Oh, I have one right here.
Oh,
Yeah, I have the one that I bought for the
The grand
ruffled bustle.
great.
Yeah, so
Mine is somewhere, but I don't know where I put it. So
yeah,
I probably
got
pulled it
the
out for class and then set it aside. So yeah, those are 1/4 inch wide.
yeah, and they're yeah. It's not
It's
not
this.
even as heavy as the plastic covered one I have.
No. And it
But
does fine, by the way. So it will hold up to your skirts. It will support just about everything. I haven't had it fail on me. I did find that the hoop steel was more robust. I liked it better. It's hard to come by. So yeah, I think maybe her instructions about the width of the bias is just a leftover from when you could use hoop steel. So you can size down your bias a little bit. Yeah.
well, yeah, am I still, did I mute myself? No.
No.
Um, yeah, I did order their kit because tipping the bones is just a pain in the.
It's a pain in the tuchus.
Mhm.
It's doable, but when I don't have to, I've taken more and more to ordering pre-cut bones, even though I know how to cut and tip my own.
Yeah,
It just saves me a lot of time and hassle.
and
So
they're the right length, and it
yeah,
was $21 for the kit, which I thought was very reasonable.
it's priced very competitively. There's not much of a markup at all on that. If you were buying the bones yourself and tipping them, you would not be saving much money, maybe no money actually, because they probably have
And
wholesale
you'd be
prices.
hurting your hands.
That's right. And you'd have to deal with tipping. Ugh, it's the worst.
Yeah.
So that is a lot of information to think about as we get ready for the weekend and putting in our boning channels. I hope that you have more answers than questions. But if you have questions, please reach out to me. I will do my best to answer them in a sane and sensible manner. And sometimes it will be less sane than others, but I'm going to do my best. We will have our Sip the Tea on Friday. Sorry, we'll have our Friday tea on Friday. We'll have our Sip the Tea on Saturday, and Sunday we'll have class again. So we've got a weekend full of virtual stuff. I know I think Sunday is Mother's Day, right? So if you are not able to be here for Mother's Day, don't worry, I'll be recording and posting the class later. Our fan lacing video is up and available on Patreon or through Ticket Leap, depending on how people registered. And so you'll have that as well. So we've got some stuff. And I will see you guys on Friday, I hope. But if not, please take very good care of yourselves. Get some rest, snuggle your kitties, have the good tea, and just like enjoy the art you're making. I love everyone's fabric. I'm so excited to see your bustles. And if you're just following along, watching later, and you're like, well, I'm going to make this bustle sometime in the future, I still want to see your project when you make it. I don't care. There's no deadline. This isn't a university class. There's no test. We're having fun. So, anyway, make it when you can. I'll be excited to see it. Like literally 10 years from now, if you are like, I made this bustle cage, I will be thrilled. Okay. So, all right, everyone. Good night. I will see you hopefully Friday.
Good
Cheers.
night.